A big story at this hour. The Reserve Bank Governor Urjit Patel has broken his silence over the Punjab National Bank fraud. In a speech delivered at the National Law University in Gandhinagar, Patel has defended the Reserve Bank and said that it is simply infeasible for a banking regulator to be in every nook and corner of banking activity. He went on to add that the Reserve Bank's regulatory powers over public sector banks are weaker than those over private sector banks. Remember, this is something that we have highlighted through the course of our series, Reimagining Public Sector Banks. Ritu joins us now with more on Governor Patel's defense. Ritu, take us through the other highlights of what the RBI governor has had to say.
This is the first time that RBI Governor Urjit Patel has broken his silence on the Punjab National Bank fraud, after which several fingers were pointed at Reserve Bank of India for its lack of supervisory control and not detecting this fraud in time. But the Reserve Bank of India, in a very emotional speech, has also hit out saying you cannot blame the Reserve Bank of India alone, especially when regulatory powers over public sector banks are not completely in the hands of RBI. He began by saying on the Punjab National fraud that it was simply infeasible for the Reserve Bank of India to be in every nook and corner of the country to detect every fraud, although some might argue 12,000 is a big enough figure for the Reserve Bank of India to have been in the know. RBI also said it had issued precise instructions thrice in 2016 on these cyber security risks, and it was Punjab National Bank's internal failure to not have recognized those risks and worked on them to plug the loopholes, which is why the fraud has happened. He also said that the RBI's regulatory power over public sector banks is weak and not at the same level as its regulatory powers over private banks, given that the regulation of public sector banks is partially also in the hands of the Finance Ministry, and given this deep fissure in the landscape of Indian banking regulatory regime, there was bound to be tremors felt in the form of the fraud that we have seen. He said the market discipline mechanism for public sector banks is much weaker compared to private banks, which is why there are more instances of fraud in public sector banks versus private sector banks. He also said now there is a need to refocus away from this fraud, but also on the stressed asset problem that has been building up. He said the stressed asset magnitude is larger than the 8.5 lakh crore rupee stress that is visible on bank balance sheets, and that the Reserve Bank of India is working to counter that through its policies like the divergence norms that it had introduced recently. They also, RBI governor also came out in defense of the new NPA regulation scheme, also, something that has been criticized by several industry experts, saying that at the heart of this new framework for NPA resolution, that is a 12th February circular, is IBC, which he says is one of the best regulations to have come out in the last several decades, and that will help ensure that banking NPAs come down in the future, and it breaks the nexus between the bankers and the borrowers. Lastly, there were some suggestions for revitalizing public sector banks, where he's blamed, partially the onus on the government, which is the owner of public sector banks, saying they must consider privatization in not so many words. What he said is there is a need for a level playing field between public and private sector banks, and the government must inform itself about optimizing the best use of scarce national resources and consider making banking regulatory powers neutral to bank ownership.